This podcast is sponsored by SoFi to help you get your money right and is for informational purposes only. Nothing in this program is a recommendation from SoFi to you or any listener. You should not rely on this program for any financial advice or legal or tax advice. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the institutional views of SoFi or its affiliates.
This is The Important Part. I'm Liz Thomas, Head of Investment Strategy at SoFi. My guest today is Emily Essner, Chief Marketing Officer at Saks Fifth Avenue. Saks is a luxury shopping institution. Its digital arm under Emily has made big bets on reaching emerging luxury consumers through live commerce, loyalty programs and exclusive events, and social media influencers. Emily first joined Saks in 2011 as the Director of Corporate Strategy, serving in various roles during the company's acquisition by Hudson's Bay Company and when Saks split off as a separate e-commerce company in 2021. Previously, she worked as a senior associate at McKinsey Company, as well as an investment banking analyst at Morgan Stanley. Emily, welcome to The Important Part.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yes, I'm very excited, especially because we are right in the middle of holiday season. So I think you are a wonderful guest for us to have today. Now, this is early to mid-December that we're doing this recording. So Black Friday sales have come and gone. That is now behind us. It seems like that starts in October these days, but everybody's still thinking about shopping. And actually, this is one of those weird years where the time period between Thanksgiving and Christmas is shortened. So it feels rushed, and this can be a really big source of stress for everybody. Not to mention that we've just gone through a couple years of really high inflation. So consumers are being a little more choosy about where they spend their dollars. For everybody who's listening, I'm sure you've heard of the brand Saks Fifth Avenue. You know what the stores are. So we're talking about the luxury consumer today. Part of why it's important to talk about the luxury consumer is because a lot of this economic cycle has been driven by the luxury consumer. And we're going to get into some of the intricacies of that. When we think about luxury, walk us through how consumers should think about spending on a luxury item, whether it's the holidays or any other time of year, at a time like this. So at a time when we've been sort of pressured by inflation, maybe economic uncertainty is higher, but we've got a positive outlook. Just walk us through what you're seeing at Saks right now.
Yeah, and thank you. I'm really excited to talk a little bit about the luxury consumer, something at Saks Fifth Avenue we think a ton about. We really view ourselves as experts on the luxury consumer. And for about 3 years or so, we have run what we call the Saks Luxury Pulse, which is a quarterly survey that we run with thousands of luxury consumers to really understand where their heads are vis-a-vis certainly our category, vis-a-vis spending in general, economic outlook, et cetera. And this is probably the story of a lot of things over the last few years, but there is certainly not a monolithic story here. But in general, the luxury consumer, in our most recent survey that we did, which was just 6-8 weeks ago or so, what we saw was that there's actually a lot of optimism out there and a lot of enthusiasm in a way that, for the last 3 years as we've been tracking this, we really candidly hadn't seen. And so in general, when we think about spending in the luxury category, what we have found from our work with the Luxury Pulse is that there is a significant correlation between how a consumer thinks about spending in the category and how they feel about the overall economic environment. It is much less correlated to their actual personal finances. And I think this goes back to the idea that spending on luxury goods, spending in our category is really an emotional decision. They tend to be things that you don't quite need, but things that you want. And so to feel good and responsible and like you're making the right decision, almost to the level of investing, you have to feel like it is a responsible decision. And so if you feel great about the economic environment, you are much more likely to make that decision. And so what we found in this most recent pulse was that consumers felt, I think, to the tune of about 12 points higher than at our last time that we had done the survey, that they were feeling significantly better about the overall macroeconomic environment, as well as feeling better about their personal financial situation. But again, the correlation is really to the overall environment.
So if you said that survey was done 6 to 8 weeks ago, that was pre-election then.
It was pre-election, and certainly we think there was, some noise in there, some questions about how are things going to come out in the election. But honestly, I thought it would be much higher. It was, I would say, relatively muted. And so I think, certainly there was some element, I imagine, of luxury as a little bit of a distraction, or shopping as a little bit of a distraction around, the noise associated with the election. But in general, less of an impact than I would have expected.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of confirms even some of the themes that had been happening in the market, where we had a lot of optimism even coming into the election, and then the election just drove it even further. It just sort of kept those trends in place, if not fueled them more. You talked about luxury being something that we want, not need. I personally can convince myself that I need.
We like that.
things.
We'll take that as well.
Yeah.
And it's all relative. Look, it is all relative. And I think for certain consumers, to your point, it depends on the price point, depends on the frequency.
Right.
But there certainly are, very, significant swaths of our consumer base that they're not going to be trading down within, the core items that they're purchasing from us. But I think there are, especially around holiday, I think there are things where you really do have to feel like, this is the right thing and feel like it's a responsible decision.
Yeah, and we'll talk about some of that a little bit deeper later. So there was an interview that you did, and you talked about luxury being durable. Can you dig into that a little bit more? What do you mean by durable?
Yeah, I was probably referring to the industry. I think sometimes you will hear luxury, like any sector, will go through its ups and its downs, and there will be trends, and some will hit and some won't. But in general, luxury as sort of as a sector is pretty durable. When you think about the sort of core elements of luxury, timelessness, craftsmanship, high quality goods, really being on, the vanguard of fashion, those are things that are perennially appealing to consumers. And so the way it is sold or what goes to market will evolve, or the specific trends and styles, of course, change. But there is something that is really, really perennial within, in that sector.
So there's an idea, and I talk about this a lot with just the consumer in general, because in investing, we can survey the consumer. We have measures of consumer sentiment, consumer confidence, and some of those measures, including retail spending, some of those measures can be very movable. They change on a dime. Consumers can change their minds very quickly. But it sounds like what you're telling me from a luxury perspective, from that subset of the market, maybe minds don't change as much. I think maybe the bigger question is, would you consider luxury inflation proof? And then even further from that, would you consider luxury recession proof? Or what can we learn from the luxury consumer in times of economic changes?
Yeah, probably a couple ways to think about it. Luxury is not inflation proof, but when we think about what we've learned from our consumer over the last couple years, they certainly were much less impacted by inflation than other consumers were. Everybody wants to feel like they are making good decisions when they are spending their money. And so while, it may not be inflation, if a consumer just views something as too expensive because they just don't understand the price value ratio, that's always going to be a problem. But that's about inflation. That's about just price changes or price increases in general. And our industry over the last few years, predating inflation, but has certainly taken, a significant amount of price increases. And so I think occasionally you'll run into situations where a consumer will just say, you know what, this just doesn't make sense. This doesn't feel, again, responsible or like the way I should be spending my money. I don't see the value here. But it tends to be less about inflation per se. And so when we think about the last couple of years and consumers really making hard trade-offs between, really core necessities, our consumer is a little bit shielded from that. And then that was the first piece on inflation. Your second question
is luxury recession proof in a way?
Luxury is not recession proof per se, but what we will find, again, there are consumers who it's going to be very hard for them to trade down or trade out of the category. They have their favorite jeans, they have their favorite moisturizer, and there will be a lot of trade-offs that they will make before they will trade out of that specific item. What we will find, and I think you really saw this in the quiet luxury trend that emerged sort of right after the pandemic, what we will find is that there will be a shift away from things that feel trendy, things that feel like sort of a one-time fashion moment, and a shift into things that feel more timeless. So more classic styles, things that you feel like are your sort of investment pieces that will last for decades.
Okay, so what do you think is the most accessible category or categories in luxury? Meaning, if you're a new luxury customer, and my instinct here would be maybe beauty products are most accessible, or fragrances, for example, because the price point isn't quite as high as going and buying a luxury handbag, but it's still that you can be in the market, right? It's the brands, a lot of the brands are the same. You can get that particular brand name. Is that fair to say that if we're looking at beauty products or fragrances, or are there smaller accessories, what's the most accessible piece? Or maybe what's the entry point into luxury?
So from a price point perspective, your perspective is certainly correct. This is something we've looked at for many years, and I think you always want to, as a marketer, I have always wanted to think there is a journey here, and a customer will start at category A. The optimal path is for them to move to category B, and then they'll move to C, and then they'll move to D. And the reality is that there's much less of that than you would expect. And so in general, what we find is that a consumer will they'll come into category A. That might be the category that they always stay at. And then otherwise, as customers come in and they explore, there's not necessarily a set path. There's not a journey that they're going on. And I think this speaks to, really the rise of personalization, which is a core strategy that we've been pursuing for a number of years, which is really around how do we serve up the very best recommendations, content, suggestions for our consumers. We have a really strong wealth of data, and so we really employ that to be able to create the best experience for our consumers. And that really is founded on this understanding that there is no one journey. But from an accessibility standpoint, certainly price point is a piece, but it's also around what is an item that a customer is going to get the most value from. And that value is very individual. It is around what is their aspiration, what are they seeing out there that they really want to add, to their wardrobe or to their life that they think is going to, help them express themselves in the way that they see themselves.
So one of the things that you mentioned from this most recent survey is that the respondents felt optimistic, they felt calm about the economic environment. So somebody from my seat as a strategist, and I look at the macro data pretty often, we would call that the wealth effect. Okay, so we've had 2 years of the S&P 500, or the market, so to speak, up 25%-ish. It was up about 24% in 2023. And then in 2024, it looks like we're going to finish up 27%, if not more, depending on how the next few weeks of trading go. So the wealth effect is this idea that consumers will spend more money when their wealth increases. So if their investment accounts are going up, they will spend more money. They're going to obviously feel better about their future prospects. My question to you on that is, I think we know that that's happening in the existing luxury consumer base. So people that have had a wealth effect go on for the last couple of years either are staying in that luxury space and continuing to spend, or maybe even increasing their spending. Have you seen an even wider audience maybe because of that? Meaning, is there this emerging luxury consumer? Has your universe increased because of this wealth effect, and you've seen more new entrants into the space over the last 2 years?
I would probably take it back a little further than 2 years, really more to sort of maybe the middle of the pandemic, depending on when you call the pandemic. And this also aligns with some strategy changes that we had as a company. We separated our digital business from our stores business, and really significantly increased investment in marketing, which allowed us to acquire more customers. So the timing was really right for us. But certainly we absolutely saw that. We acquired, I think, about 5 times as many new customers, after that separation as we had, I think, in 2019, the year before we separated our business. So again, sort of correlates with your hypothesis there. And some of that was, driven by the reality of the trade-offs that consumers were being forced to make around the pandemic. They weren't able to go out, and so they were choosing to spend some of that income in our category. And as we, sort of sit here, in late 2024, and we think about, so how has that sort of played itself out? when you think about a category like ours, where we create long-standing relationships, we are talking decades-long relationships, that experience, that interaction, that relationship that we were able to form with a broader swath of consumers, we always call it the full continuum of luxury consumers. But those relationships are things that really, we believe, stand us in very good stead for many, many years to come, because we're able to have that first interaction. We're able to understand who that customer is. We're able to contact that customer. We're able to personalize all our communications to them. And then when the moment is right for them, whether that's financially or whether there's an opportunity for them, an event that they want to shop for, or they just really want to treat themselves, we're then able to be, sort of right there in first position. And so we really think about serving, again, the full continuum of luxury customers. That is very core to our strategy, and actually very core to our brand and how we think about messaging. And that experience over the last few years, I think, really, solidifies for us why we think that makes sense for us.
How would you define that emerging luxury consumer demographically? Is there a certain age group? Is there a geographical difference? Is there anything that's distinctive about it?
They're in general, our consumers are much less monolithic than you might think. In general, probably a little bit younger, but otherwise, no, it tends to be a consumer that for whatever reason hasn't yet gotten into the category. And some of that can be around, to your point, how they have accumulated wealth over their life. Some of that can be that it hasn't been an interest, it hasn't been a need, there hasn't been something that has necessarily spoken to them from a fashion perspective. And so as trends change or as brands come in and out of fashion, those things do change.
And can you identify from this survey data, do you do it once a year? Is it
No,
once a year?
4 times a year.
4 times. Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's even better. So can you identify from when it began in 2021 until now, have there been thematic shifts in how luxury consumers look at this category or what their spending looks like? Are there different demands? Do they want different things? And then on top of that, how has Saks adjusted maybe their marketing strategy to respond to it and stay relevant and still stay in front of them and garner that attention? And
Yeah.
I'm hoping that we can glean something from that as far as other retailers might also run their marketing strategy.
Yeah. So when we look over the last few years, I think so certainly this correlation between how a consumer feels about spending in the category most correlated to the overall macroeconomic environment. That's insight number one. And that has proved to be the case over the, call it 12 surveys that we've run. A overall thematic insight has been interest in experiences. So we started running, these surveys, sort of shortly after the pandemic, when the world sort of started opening up again, a ton of interest that we saw in travel. And in this most recent survey, I was surprised to see that the interest in travel was yet higher than it had been previously. I thought we had, probably reached the heights. We had not. And even as you bake in the inflation that's been, inherent in that space, still a lot more demand out there. This speaks to, I think, a potentially bigger consumer shift that may be, I don't know, never say permanent, but that may be a little bit longer standing from the pandemic, which is this idea of making up for lost time, where I think consumers over the course of the pandemic felt like they lost things. They lost birthdays and graduations and weddings and Christmases and vacations that had been long planned. And I think when the world opened back up again, there was a real feeling of, I'm going to make up for lost time. I understand that I can't control things. I don't know where life is going to take me. And so when I have an opportunity to celebrate, when there is something special, I'm going to do all of it. It is not that I'm just going to go on a trip. I'm going to go and get a fabulous wardrobe for that trip so I can take the most amazing photos and feel fabulous. I'm going to celebrate Christmas and celebrate holidays in a huge way. We really saw that come out actually in this most recent survey, where consumers are buying gifts, they're decorating their houses, they're feeling the spirit of the season. That was actually a question we asked. And they're doing it, vast majority of consumers that we are surveying are saying yes to those things, because I think there is this feeling of, I missed things And I understand that life is not permanent, and I'm going to make the most of it while I have it. And so I think that is something that I'm surprised that we're still seeing it to the level that we are. I wondered if that was going to be sort of a temporary thing coming out of the pandemic. And I think it might be a little bit longer standing.
Yeah, that does surprise me too. And then further that point, how did you shift your marketing strategy, or did you shift it? Did you focus then more on what you talked about, the wardrobe for travel or the wardrobe for holidays, or whatever it may be, maybe more of a special event type of marketing?
So we certainly use insights from the luxury pulse to help drive, some of our specific communication. So when you think about, specific elements of content that we might want to create, absolutely travel is something. It's been important for a while, but it certainly gives us a lot of confidence that we're going to run a story on travel and we're going to pick, a few specific locations and curate a fantastic wardrobe to wear that's going to perform well. Gives us lots of confidence in our ability to do that. Similarly, around gift giving, around celebrating, around really, again, sort of making the most of everyday celebration out there. But I think it also speaks to a maybe bigger point around the role of inspiration in our marketing. When we, sort of step way back and think about what does our brand need to stand for? It stands for certainly a few things, but first and foremost, the emphasis that we have, in our marketing, in our content, in our messaging is around the idea of inspiration. And a lot of that came from this recognition that our consumers really want all of it. And they want this full experience and this full expression. And so they really want to be able to see themselves in our brand and really focusing on, not just the specifics of that one item, but really crafting a full life, and inviting our customers into that is really where we win.
Yeah. And I can imagine social media has a lot to do with it. I mean, there's so many consumers today that get all of their inspiration from social media. I think we don't mean to, right? You're scrolling through whatever the platform is that you use, and you've got this really great targeted ad. I have fallen for them. I mean, on a weekly basis, I fall for them because the algorithm has it figured out. They know exactly what to show me, when to show it to me, and they make it so easy to just click, 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 buy. Right. And it arrives on my doorstep and it's done. And I think that has been a huge shift in the marketplace. So one of the things that continues to be more and more important for every retailer, it doesn't matter what category you're in, it could be cost conscious, could be luxury, could be any type of good or service as well, is brand loyalty. And you've talked about your consumers being very loyal and their lifetime consumers, or at least long-term consumers over decades of time, because that's become so much more difficult to cultivate and maintain for retailers. How has Saks done it? If you feel like you've been successful, I guess maybe that's the first question. Have you been successful at that in this more competitive environment? And then how did you become successful at it?
It's hard. It's really hard, to your point. There's a ton of competition. There's a ton of noise out there, but it's something that we're really laser focused on. Loyalty, retention, bringing our customers back time after time, year after year is one of our, most core KPIs. And it goes back to a real focus that we have on lifetime value. We have a very clear understanding of the lifetime value of our customers. We start tracking it after that very first purchase, start predicting it after that very first purchase. And we have a pretty clear understanding at this point of what are the ways in which we can encourage a customer's LTV. How do we help drive it up? And so there are certain behaviors that we know are associated with a higher LTV customer. For example, downloading the app, being on our emails, creating an account. And so it allows us to incent certain behaviors in a different way and be able to sort of understand how far we can take those, as well as we craft customer journeys, really understanding what are the most important things that we should be driving and where in the journey after, let's say after a customer makes their first purchase, how quickly should we be following up with making sure that they're creating an account? How quickly should we be following up with making sure that they're downloading the app? How are we incenting their use of the app? Those are just a few examples of places where we know that if we're getting a consumer into the app, we know it's a super immersive experience, very inspiring, and we know that their LTV, chances are, is going to go up. And so it enables our teams to think about investment in a much more fine-tuned way while being able to drive that loyalty and drive that retention.
I'm wondering about, we've all heard stories about certain brands, and I think just consumers in general, or Americans in general, you have an idea about a certain brand, whether or not you know that you actively think about this brand. So, for example, something like Ritz-Carlton and their reputation for going above and beyond for their customers, well beyond what you would expect from a hotel to do. I mean, I've heard some really ridiculous stories about, like rose-scented toilet water and all these different things that Ritz is just like, you know what? The consumer wants it. We're going to do it. And now they've got that reputation. And then there are some other retailers. I have some in my head right now, but that could just be my experience personally. How far down into those nitty-gritty details are you getting? Because I think some of that is really important. And if we're talking about luxury as a durable good, you also want the customer to be happy with what they've purchased. And if they get home and they're not happy with it for whatever reason, whether you agree with their reason or not, I think the retailers that make it easy for the customer to come back and say, you know what, I changed my mind and I still want to get what I want. I want to get it here. If it's easy for them to do, I imagine that would foster loyalty as well.
We think of, to your point, we have a good understanding of the drivers of positive LTV. We have a good understanding of the drivers of negative LTV. And so to your point, yes, a bad customer experience can certainly impact LTV. We know it impacts LTV. It's a part of, it obviously influences how we think about policies, how we think about communication. The point of having these insights is really so that we can help drive our teams to understand what is most important, help driving priorities, and help driving how we allocate our resources. Understanding that, there's a fair bit of complexity in our system. There's hundreds of thousands of products. There's many, many times more customers. And so thinking about, putting that all together and all of the transactions that we're doing in our stores and online every day, the more that we can give our teams parameters to understand this is what we know is important to our customers. This is what we know drives value with them. And so push hard here. This isn't as important. Don't push as hard here. That's super helpful. And that's how we think about LTV as a framework for our business.
Okay. You've said before something along the lines of resource allocation being the most important thing that senior leaders can spend their time on. Talk to me more about that. What does that philosophy mean to you at Saks in particular and at a retail company, and maybe how it feeds into or how it informs your approach to innovation?
I believe this wholeheartedly, that when I say resource allocation, I am thinking about time. I'm thinking about certainly investment, thinking about projects that we're doing. And it's all around how do we prioritize? What is going to matter? What isn't going to matter? And so resource allocation for me is sort of a synonym of what is most important. How are we prioritizing? Where do we want to get? And so those are things where I think a lot about, like, what are the things that only the senior leaders can do? And I think one of them is sort of setting out the priorities and setting out, the rubric in which we are going to work. There was an article I read years and years ago around how businesses that had multiple operating companies sometimes would allocate resources evenly. And this was, while you can understand sort of emotionally why you would get there, these people, it's of course a terrible idea because not all businesses have the same growth trajectory, not all businesses have the same economics, have the same prospects. And so that really influenced me. And that was a number of years ago. And so I think really hard about being really stringent in how we, especially our actual investment dollars, but in general our time, but being really stringent about where, what are the bets we're going to make and really sticking to those things. And so, it does come down to, what are the most important priorities? Probably our number one priority is really driving personalization across our overall experience. We have had a industry leading personalization from an email and owned channel perspective. And now we're really taking that and we're bringing that to our website experience, something we've made a ton of progress on this year and look to build further next year. But that's an example of saying out loud to our teams, this is something we really believe in. That also means that there's other things that we're not going to work on, and that's okay. But our job here is to make the hard trade-offs and is to say where we think the most important bets are to make to drive our business and that are going to have the most growth associated with them.
Those are the hardest decisions I think that any leader has to make. You can't do it all. You can't have it all. There's not enough money to spend on all of the different initiatives that you want to do. So you have to prioritize and then hope that you're right about the priorities and hope that you're right about your customer base and that you know them well enough to understand what's going to land, how much of an effect it's going to have, and where you should have spent that time. So I empathize with that. So we started with the holiday season. Let's end with a holiday question. This will come out just before Christmas and some of the big spending days. Loyalty programs and holiday promotions have long been something that many of us, especially people in my seat, look to for some kind of gauge on how economic forces are going, right? If you start to feel like retailers are over promoting or we're getting deeper discounts, it must mean that they're not selling enough, or it must mean that there's too much inventory built up. First of all, just in general, how much do you think we can glean from those types of data points? And second of all, is that something that luxury does differently? Do you not do deep discounts? Do you not do as many holiday promotions? Or is it something that luxury reads differently for their market?
In terms of your first question, how much can you read from promotions? A little bit, but you have to really know the context. We're talking dozens year over year. And so we have a really good understanding of what we would expect, promotions that we would say were our anniversary, done year after year. And so unless you are the sort of consumer, and we do have some of these customers who truly understand the calendar, unless you really understand it, you probably can't glean that much because there's so much that's sort of baked into the system. I would say our industry certainly is, while it has evolved, and I would say one of the biggest themes within our industry has been the rise of more targeted or private promotions, so things that aren't necessarily publicly available, but that are personalized for you or a cohort of customers who look like you. There certainly is much less promotion in our industry than there is, probably, consumer market writ large. That said, probably a little bit more than there should be, but it's a super interesting area because it is one that can constantly be optimized. We test a ton here, and we're really able to understand how to drive specific behaviors, whether that's around new customer acquisition or whether that's around profitability, return visits, all sorts of things that we can at this point, sort of direct through a promotion.
Okay. Well, Emily, thank you so much. This will be the last episode of the year for us. So you're wrapping up all of 2024 for us, no pressure. But thank you so much. I think this is a really great material for people to hear during the holiday season as we try to figure out if the consumer is staying as strong as we've expected. And it sounds like certainly they are in the luxury segment. They've been very surprisingly resilient over the entire year. Okay, so let's finish with some of these shorter segments. We do these kind of short questions, short answers. The first one is called The Word. Sum up your strategy for converting emerging luxury consumers into loyal consumers in one word.
Personalization.
Okay, that bespoke feeling and the experience that they would have at a luxury retailer versus a big box or a more price-conscious retailer.
Yeah, something that's for you.
Yeah. Okay, second one is called the aha moment. What was the moment when you realized you could pivot your banking and consulting experience into the marketing world?
I don't know if this is acceptable. There probably was not one moment because it really was much more of a journey. But I've always been really interested in understanding consumers and understanding what makes them tick. It took me a while to figure out exactly how to sort of make that come to life, and saw it from a few different angles before ending up in this role.
Okay. And then the last one, usually we do this if we're talking to an investor, the best worst trade, but we can do this more like the best or worst purchase for you. What has been a valuable purchase of a luxury good that you have made for yourself?
So I certainly think of luxury and fashion as very emotional, but I had purchased a number of years ago the most incredible Gucci cape that I just saw and had to have, and then ended up going to the Met's Costume Institute exhibit and seeing it there. So
oh, wow.
I keep it very pristine and only wear it very, very rarely, but it's a very prized possession.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you again. This has been tremendously useful for me. I hope for other people too. Happy holidays, and thank you for all your time today.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I got 3 big takeaways, and maybe takeaways is not the right word. It's more surprising elements from that interview. This part, maybe not so surprising. Optimism and enthusiasm from luxury consumers this year in the Saks Luxury Pulse survey. has been more so than in recent years. So the optimism and enthusiasm has actually increased. And remember, this last survey that they did was actually pre-election, so perhaps is even more surprising. This matters because spending is an emotional decision. And what I found surprising about her takeaway was that how a consumer feels is actually more important than what's going on in their actual personal finances to influence their spending decisions. So it's about those vibes, it's about the sentiment, and it's about how the consumer feels more than what's actually going on in the bank account. The second big takeaway that we talked about was that luxury as a sector is durable. So trends and styles change, as we know, but there's something very perennial about luxury. And she said it's not inflation-proof, it's not necessarily recession-proof, but luxury consumers are less impacted by inflation, I think for obvious reasons, but they're also less likely to trade down. So it ends up being a more durable purchase in that category. And then lastly, over 3 years of surveys that they've done, interest in experiences, so things like travel and celebrating, has continued to be very strong and continued to see strong demand even into 2024. So we had assumed, and self-included, assumed that some of this would have died off by now post-pandemic, but it's still very strong. Consumers are still making up for lost time since the pandemic, and she suggested that this might actually be a permanent theme in consumers. Life is not permanent, and the idea of getting back to those experiences will just continue to be important as people spend. So I enjoyed that episode so much. I think it was very timely because we've talked about the luxury consumer as being really important to driving the economy all the way through 2024 and actually back in 2023 as well. It's remained so strong. So I'm glad that we got to have some really important insight from Emily on that. I hope that you all enjoyed that episode as much as I did, and I look forward to bringing you the next one very soon. For more from me, read my weekly column every Thursday on the SoFi blog or follow me on X at Liz Thomas Strat. Follow The Important Part wherever you get your podcasts. The Important Part is produced by SoFi in partnership with Pod People.
This episode of The Important Part was recorded on December 10th, 2024.
The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the institutional views of SoFi or its affiliates. This program should not be copied, distributed, published, or reproduced in whole or in part or disclosed by any recipient to any other person without the express written consent of SoFi. Each name of any organization mentioned in this program is the property of the company to which it relates, is used here strictly for informational and identification purposes only, and is not used to imply any authority, ownership, or license rights between any such company and SoFi. The content of this program is not a recommendation from SoFi to you or any listener or recipient of this program, and is provided for informational purposes only. SoFi is not providing any financial, economic, legal, investment, accounting, or tax advice through this program, or to its recipient, and you and any person should not rely on this program for any advice. Investment decisions should be based on specific financial needs, goals, and risk appetite. SoFi has no obligation to provide updates or changes to the information in this program. Past performance of any investments mentioned does not guarantee future results, which may vary. Neither SoFi nor any of its affiliates makes any representation or warranty, express or implied, as to the accuracy or completeness of the statements or any information contained in this program. Any liability for any statements in this program is expressly disclaimed by SoFi. For additional disclosures related to the SoFi Invest platforms described above, please visit sofi.com/legal.